Thanks for joining us again for the final two sessions of our online event, and hopefully you've been enjoying it up to date. We've all certainly been enjoying having these discussions and learning from them. So we have a panel session now until 3 o'clock, and then of course our keynote speaker Grace Tame will join us. So let me introduce the panellists who will be discussing supporting, reporting and measuring all topics that we've actually already heard a little bit about today. So I have Dr. Skye Saunders, who's an Associate Professor in the School of Law at University of New England. She's a recognised expert in the field of sex discrimination law. And I happen to know, because Skye and I connected on Facebook, that she's also just got married. So thank you very much for joining us today, Skye, and making time for us. She's also done some incredible work around workplace sexual harassment of Australian rural women, which is something that she wrote a book about. And in 2018, 19 and 20, she was selected to attend the United Nations Commission on the Status of Women in New York with YWCA Australia. And she has a great depth of experience in the area of the law and sex discrimination. Great to have her along. We're also joined by Sally Moyle, who's an honorary associate professor at ANU. Until August 2019, Sally was actually CEO of Care Australia. And prior to that, she was principal gender specialist and assistant secretary with DFAT, Australian Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade. She has a terrific career where she's worked in senior roles at the Australian Human Rights Commission and the Law Reform Commission. So great to have her along. Hi, Sally. And finally, right next to me on the couch, which is lovely, is Rita Butera. Now, Rita is the CEO of Safe Steps Family Violence Response Centre, which a role she's been in since 2019, overseeing Victoria's only 24/7 crisis response service and specialist trauma counselling through 1800-RESPECT. In her former role, she's been CEO at Women's Health Victoria and had a number of other human services roles over the years in various levels of government. Now, because you're right next to me, Rita, let's start out by asking you a little bit about that supporting part of our topic today. Tell us a little bit about what Safe Steps does and some of those important sort of key steps towards supporting people who are facing workplace sexual harassment or indeed women facing violence.
Yeah, absolutely. Look, Safe Steps is Victoria's only 24/7 crisis response service in Victoria. And I have to say I've spent many years working both in prevention and response, and I think it's just so important, the points that have been made, that you need both. But obviously, if we can get the prevention right, if we invest more in prevention, that's where we want to see the change, because that impacts on the response, and so important. But Safe Steps is there, along with 1800-RESPECT, to provide support services for victims of sexual harassment, sexual assault, sexual abuse, domestic and family violence as well. When I moved into Safe Steps a couple of years ago, I had previous to that been working very much in the prevention space and thought, you know, I really wanted to get back involved in the response to support victims. And when I suppose one of the things that happened for me was I was quite surprised. In fact, I was pretty shocked at the prevalence, at you know, having worked in this industry, in the human services industry for, you know, some 20 to 30 years, to see the prevalence in terms of family violence. And we're still seeing a woman murdered a week by partner or ex-partner. And at Safe Steps, we're getting over 200 to 300 calls per day. This is per day from victim survivors. But look, encouraging to also know that over the COVID period, we've seen about a 20% increase from callers who are family, friends, or somebody concerned. And that's great to see more people standing up and taking an interest and wanting to make a call to find out how they can help as well. So that's really encouraging. And I think what we've noticed with the Me Too movement and the March for Justice, the dialogue has increased. And with that dialogue, people have felt more comfortable in coming out and having a conversation. And with 1800-RESPECT, you know, about 133% increase in calls during this time. There's sexual assault services in every state. as well, and they've seen around a 35 to 75% increase in calls for support. Now, that's not a bad thing. It's really good to see that people are making that brave decision to tell their story, and some of them have been for the first time, which is quite extraordinary.
So do you think that's because some of that stigma about actually talking about, but also revealing that that's happening to you, that has been eroded a little bit since Me Too?
Yeah, and I think people are having more confidence. But I think the one thing also as a soft entry point with these lies, they're confidential and they're anonymous, and you can approach them carefully and you can talk about what's happened in a safe way. And we have specialist counsellors whose work is very much victim-centred, which is really important, and trauma-informed.
Yeah.
Really important to acknowledge those things in those conversations, that the agency of the person who calls is critical in next steps. And it may not be immediately after the event. Some callers were calling older women who had had experiences many years ago and had never ever shared that experience ever before. So it was great to see. It's great to see that the sort of the conversation, the dialogue, having much more exposure around the issues is actually encouraging people to reach out for help.
Yes, it is. I mean, one hesitates to sort of make it sound rosy, but it is a promising change, so it's good to hear that. Sally, can I ask you some questions about one of the other areas that we wanted to talk about today, reporting and measuring. And I'm thinking perhaps now from an organisational perspective. How do you think organisations, or the organisations that you've had some familiarity with, are they stepping up? Is there more tendency? We've had a couple of strands of discussion during this forum already around the need to report and to measure and have an evidence base, something that Kate Jenkins' recommendations also covers. Is that starting to be something we're seeing a bit more of in organisations of all kinds, I guess?
Thank you. Thanks for inviting me. Look, yes, I think so. We are going through a moment of change. There's no doubt about that. And the Me Too movement, and particularly the events that have happened that come to light over the course of this year up at Parliament House, have really focused people's minds. So it was as a result of some of that, in fact, and following Kate Jenkins' report, that I was asked by the Institute of Company Directors to write a guidance note for board members on how to manage sexual harassment. And I think that has really started to kind of create a level of interest. So it was probably one that was watched closely by directors. They're beginning to get really aware of it. But some organisations have been aware of this for a long time, and we've heard through the course of today's discussion that how important leadership is for this. And so, for example, when I was at Care Australia, I managed in 7 countries, 900 people, and made sure that every single allegation of harassment or bullying came to me. We were really aware of the fact that you need to hold very close and confidential the reports of sexual harassment, but I felt it was really important that I saw these first, and generally speaking, they would be dealt with really quickly and at a very senior level in the countries where they happened. There weren't many, because Care Australia was an organisation that cared about gender equality and had for a long time. There weren't many traditional sexual harassment claims, but there were, allegations about from members of the community, for example. Sometimes there were allegations of harassment. So. But we dealt with that at a very senior level, and people knew that I knew, and that it was, I think that demonstrates the seriousness of this. So I do think there's changes happening, and it's largely where you've got strong leaders who care about gender equality and care about building a respectful environment, and maybe some of those that have experienced it and seen the damage that it can do to an organisation's culture. So. And then seeing what's happening publicly play out in Australia at such senior levels, I think, is focusing people's minds as well.
Yes.
So I do think that there's a change happening now. There's a step up. But having worked on sex discrimination, sexual harassment over the last 25 odd years, I can say that we've seen these moments of power probably every 5 years. Something changes and we step up our attention, and then a lot of that evaporates again. So we go back to a level of complacency. We're nowhere near where we need to be. But I think each step forward, even if there's we take 2 steps forward, even if there's 1 step back, it gives us at least one step forward. So this is one of those moments where we're seeing 2 steps forward.
Yeah, I agree. And Rita and I were just saying, I think even the conversation about this has changed. The tone of it, the candour with which people discuss these issues has changed. I know that's not the end of the story by any means, but I think that we have shifted. So, and we've already talked about younger women who are quite uncompromising now and refuse to be victim blamed and so on. And I think that's been a real shift too. Skye,
just to say very quickly, Catherine, I really agree with you. I think one of the main substantive changes we've seen this time around at this moment of change is the focus, the uncompromising attitude of young women that just go, I'm not ashamed of it. It's not me. I didn't do anything. It's not my fault. It's their fault. So I think that's absolutely something that I have a lot of faith in.
Yes, and don't criticise me because I had some, wines that night. I refuse to, take that. Skye, I just wanted to ask you, there's quite a lot of recommendations, clearly in the Respect at Work report, but actually some in the report that Prue Goward, who we had on a little earlier, did for the New South Wales government. Quite a lot of calls for legal reform, changes to definitions, looking at the Sex Discrimination Act and so on. Can you tell me about some of the areas that you think should be concentrated on? What are some of the key priorities for legal reframing around this area?
It's very interesting that you should ask that question, Catherine, because in the work that I've done, which is largely concentrated on sexual harassment in the rural context, where things are all the more complex because we've got quite a lot of overlapping threads that are sort of intersecting and creating sort of a bit of a mess in the context of different perspectives on the sexual harassment issue. I sort of unpack those perspectives in the context of the work that I've done and have really, I guess, concluded that we have relatively solid law in the form of the Sex Discrimination Act. The translation of that relatively solid law, is lost in translation somewhere between Parliament House and our shearing sheds and our cattle stations and our, meatworks. We have a bit of a disaster on our hands. And the work that I did in the context of situating sexual harassment in the rural male-dominated space sort of leads us to see that we have women, for example, we have a cohort of women, 107 of whom I met and sat with and spoke to on their verandas and in the pubs and so on, who are saying that as a daily norm, they are surviving various forms of very highly sort of ruralised, behaviours. And by that we mean things like we've got boots being urinated on before women go down into the mines. We've got women who are going out moving cattle with, relatively new associates who are sort of, they're on contract. And they're being subjected to the sounds of pornography being played on portable DVD players overnight whilst on that stock run, for example. We've got law that says that this is not okay. We've got that already. We've got law that says sexual harassment is completely unacceptable. And beyond that, we've got law that says, in the form of Section 106 of the Sex Discrimination Act, that employers and senior managers are vicariously liable if they don't take all reasonable steps to ensure that that's not the case. And if they don't, for example, have policy and training and so on, that's a practical implementation of that duty. It's lost in translation. So what we actually have is a cultural dilemma. And I think that it really does help us to unpack that and to consider that through the lens of men, women and employers quite separately. Because I think that, as Prue alluded to earlier, the complexity is such that, for men, for example, we have sexual harassment being so normalised in rural workplaces, and indeed in some non-rural workplaces too, that it is completely underestimated in terms of its impact. So we have men who are labouring under what has been performed over generations gone by, and that sort of, demonstration of what it is to be a man in the bush, what it is to live up to the stereotypical, Crocodile Dundee, through to the Man from Snowy River, through to all of the different popular representations of hard-earned thirsts being sort of, attained at the end of a day. And you have then a dilemma through the male lens, where we've got this sort of notion of what it is to perform masculinity according to everything that's been showed. And yet we've got Me Too movement and post-Me Too all of a sudden loudly crackling through the media that this is no longer okay. Everything that you've known previously about what it is to be a man is suddenly wiped out, inverted commas. And the dilemma is that there is a lot of shame, there is a lot of fear about behaviour that's already happened in the past that people have no control over necessarily then, but moving forward, of course, we need to be resetting a channel such that we have control over future. But there's a real dilemma there through the male perspective. Equally, we've got a dilemma when we think about the law that exists already through the lens of employers and senior managers, because that notion of what it is to take all reasonable steps to discharge that vicarious liability is again lost in translation. We have 83% of the people whom I interviewed who were in senior management positions, running large stations and so on, just said that they would just rather not have the conversation about sexual harassment at all and simply get on with it, because there's a list as long as our arm of things that we need to do to get through the day, and quite frankly, sexual harassment's not going to be the top of the list before sunset on any given day. So we need to be resetting the parameters of what that duty of care and how to discharge that vicarious liability actually works. And then finally, through the lens of women, of course, we've got sexual harassment then becoming so normalised and so underestimated and unopposed, so underestimated by men and unopposed, that it goes unreported or underreported. And so that notion of, Laura Bates speaks of the reams and reams of tiny pinpricks, so normalised that to call each one would seem facetious. And indeed, this is the way that women slowly develop a tolerance for the harassment that becomes part of the daily norm. So, I mean, we can talk about, the law reform to a large extent, but at the moment, even working with the good foundations of the law that Prue was alluding to before, the Sex Discrimination Act of 1984 is a useful starting point, and we're failing even in that useful starting point.
Well, that's fairly bleak, but I do take your point. I mean, one of the other areas, though, that has also come up today, and I've written about recently, is this need to maybe expand that whole idea of workplace health and safety so that it includes psychological safety. And having heard Rita's comments about that increase in the number of women, or people close to them who are now saying, yes, this is happening to me. Is this an area that we need to push further on? And I guess I'm asking all of you for some input here. Do we need to actually make it an obligation, whether it's a large rural enterprise or it's a department of the government, where we actually say that your obligation is to keep people safe psychologically as well as physically? Because we did have a big shift in this country around OH&S, and that is something that a lot of organisations take quite seriously. Have we got the beginnings there of something that we can amend and then make stick? And Rita, you're nodding.
Look, I'm nodding because I'm aware that just very, very recently the Ministers for Safety, national and state ministers, have made an agreement to look at regulation around psychological safety in the workplace, and that sexual harassment and gendered violence are part of that. So I think that's a really good starting point. We're yet to see what that means in practice and how that will find its way in workplaces.
And I know Kate Jenkins, when I interviewed her a few weeks back, said she was also aware that some bodies were actually looking at that, including, I think she said, Fair Work. So actually redefining what we mean by health and safety in organisations. Sally, what's your thought on that?
Yeah, no, I agree. I mean, it was a big step forward to even have sexual harassment in the broad included workplace health and safety issue. It's been something that we've been talking about for 20 years. You know, it's been something that we've been saying it really does need to be considered as a workplace health and safety obligation. And it's only just recently that that's been done. So that was a step forward. And so it is another great step forward that that they're now talking in the same context of thinking about psychological safety. But the concern that I have is that, just exactly as Skye said, a lot of the behaviours that are slowly, drip by drip, making women feel excluded from workforces, each of them individually too small to be considered as for women to consider complaining about them. It's just the shit you put up with, right? And I do think that the psychological safety piece is going to be an extreme of that. It's going to be really hard for each of those pieces of behaviour to be seen on its own as an individual complaint. So I think that we're getting to the stage where we really need to start thinking about the legal framework that goes beyond individual complaints. That we need to see, not only because it's borne on the back by the woman who's willing to make a complaint. I mean, they have to carry the burden of the legal process and changing the culture of the organisation that they work in on their own back. And that's always been unfair, and we've always known that. And if you ask women why they don't complain about incidents of sexual harassment, they will always say, I didn't think that it was worth it, or I didn't think that the behaviour was extreme enough, or I couldn't be, I didn't have the wherewithal to carry a complaint by myself. So we know that the current individual complaint space is excluding a large proportion of people who would otherwise complain. And I think as we take the step forward to thinking in a more positive sense about psychological safety, that's going to absolutely be the case, that we need to think in a new way about the legal framework that would be devised around that.
How would that work? I'm just interested, because I agree with you, absolutely, putting the onus on individual women who are then vulnerable, and we know, as Prue Goward again said, we all know, it doesn't matter how many times you tell a woman, come forward, you'll be safe if you complain, that the reality is there are repercussions and penalties that are very real. So how would you foresee that actually working in practice, where that onus is not on those individual women, but those problems are still being addressed?
Well, one of the with the recommendations that wasn't accepted by government from the Respect at Work report was that the Sex Discrimination Commissioner have, as of right, investigative power and an auditing power for organisations and sectors and industries. And I think, and that wasn't accepted. And I think that was a very, very regressive position. I think that's we absolutely need to have an audit function and an oversight function. And I think that it's important to have organisational leadership, boards and executives, having a responsibility to proactively oversee and make sure that there is a safe organisations. There's a lot of work to be done in identifying how you would calculate that, and clearly that's what we're here to talk about today, is about how we measure these things. But I do think that we need to provide an overarching responsibility on the organisations themselves to assure themselves that they can deliver a workplace that's safe, and external oversight and audit capacities by the Sex Discrimination Commissioner or the Workplace Gender Equality Agency or other commissioner like that.
Skye, do you think that's something that we should be considering, that organisations should be?
Absolutely. Look, anything that makes life easier in the context of that reporting process for women, I think, is exactly where we need to be turning our attention, as Sally's said. I recently did a series of interviews with women who had chosen to make a sex discrimination complaint, and I was interested to ask them what that pivotal moment was for them that was such that they felt that it was time to do that, whether or not it be within the workplace or whether it be externally to the Human Rights Commission. I was interested in understanding what that experience was like for women, how they felt supported or how they didn't feel supported, and to what extent they understood the process, even if the complaint had been made to the Human Rights Commission, for example, and who was that source of information along the way, and who was the guiding sort of person, noting that it's relatively rare to have legal representation in the Human Rights Commission at that sort of early conciliation stage. And finally, the third question that I was interested in understanding was, is it worth it? And I think the jury's out at the moment as to whether it is worth going through that process, given that there are holes in the system as it currently stands, I believe. For example, that very thing that I said a moment ago, the fact that it's you need to apply to have someone to come along for conciliation by way of being a legal support for you. That in itself, I think, is a huge barrier for many women, particularly those who continue to work in the very same workplace that they're actually making a complaint about. So yes, I wholeheartedly endorse what Sally's suggested.
Yeah, and that, of course, if it came into being, would also help with the power disparities, which we know are at the absolute root of that. Rita, I want to ask you a little bit more about the practical side of support. Now, understanding that a lot of the people that you're dealing with at Safe Steps, it's maybe family violence and so on, but what is helpful when women, or indeed people close to them, ring up? They're facing this awful situation. They've possibly already had that internal conflict about whether they actually reach out for help. What are the steps that you typically go through with someone who calls?
So look, at Safe Steps, one of the things is really important and paramount is physical safety in the first instant. Yep. And then psychological and emotional safety as well. Yep. But physical safety, because it's so focused on danger, and we have 100 women and children every night who are in a crisis accommodation, escaping danger. So that's quite significant. With regards to psychological safety and trauma-informed practice, with 1-800-RESPECT, what we have is counsellors who are skilled specifically in trauma counselling. And so it's really understanding where the victim is at, and really providing a safe environment emotionally, culturally, in every way to allow that person their own agency to share what they have to say. And I think Kate does talk about support services in the workplace and how important it is also to have a victim-centred approach and trauma-informed. But you may need to bring that expertise in. But as well as that, one of the other recommendations that Kate had made in her report was to extend the role of 1-800-RESPECT in providing support for workplace sexual harassment. And that was actually agreed to by government. So I think that's also important to recognise that this is an additional service that will be available. So whether it's in the workplace or outside of the workplace, we need to have a whole combination of options to provide to victims so they can make that choice.
And in fact, again, the Respect at Work report and a number of other pieces I've read talk about having an independent person to either assess what's going on in an organisation, also to provide that kind of counselling and feedback.
Absolutely, and they're very important skills that someone brings to those very, very difficult conversations.
Yeah, and I mean, I suppose that's an interesting one for employers too, to have the skills that they can, as I say, it's important to also have an independent person, arbiter if you like, but do we, I mean, my sense is that many employers still don't have that, that there's not that capacity, unless, I mean, there may be some exceptions, but on the whole, I just wonder, Skye and Sally, if that's a correct impression, or if in fact we are seeing a bit more investment in those kinds of skills within larger organisations.
Look, I think that we've got a long way to go, and I do think, I also think that there's a real tension between the fact that often it's your highest performers, the kind of really macho, arrogant types that are the ones that are more likely to be the harassers, right? And that they often are the rainmakers, or they bring a lot of money in. And there's this tension on the part of senior management or the directors to kind of go, well, yes, I recognise that he's a bad guy, but he's making so much money, he's a star. And they've just got to get over that. They've got to get to the stage of just going, he's out. You know, the culture, as is, I think someone said earlier, we know culture eats strategy for breakfast. Culture eats everything for breakfast, and we need to get to the stage where leaders recognise that the main thing is to make sure that you've got a workplace where everybody's supported, and everybody can be a star, and everybody is respectful in doing so. So I think there's a long way to go, where there's different incentives and disincentives against dealing effectively and strongly with sexual harassment. We've got to change those incentives.
Yeah.
And indeed, I think as you were speaking then, Sally, I was reminded of, following on from Liz Broderick's work, looking at sexual harassment and abuse in the Defence Force. We heard the former Chief of Army speaking the words around, that it's, if you think it's okay to behave in a way that demeans or exploits colleagues, then you have no place in this army, and if that doesn't suit you, get out. And I think that it becomes a challenge for employers when you do have the rainmakers and you do have those who are performing at such a high level, and yet you have that conundrum, because if it just so happens that those same people are the ones who are actually, the problem, then it really does require giving voice to values, to workplace values, at its highest level. And I mean, you can't give voice to the values, I think Brene Brown says, in fact, you can't give voice to values that you're not clear on yourself. And so I think this comes to that point where we have to recognise that, first port of call is really understanding as leaders what those workplace values are that really do need to be disseminated and expressed and explained regularly, through policy, through training, through all of the work that you do with your teams. And I think that that's the point at which, if you can't buy in to those workplace values once they're expressed and explained and understood, if you can't then abide by those values, it's time then to move on. And that needs to, I think that aligns with what the former Chief of Army's message was.
And I just think if you don't explicitly set your culture will grow anyway. It will grow around those unspoken and those unseen things. And so I think in this case, it's often it's overlooked. It needs to be a key part of the explicit culture that's established in every organisation. We're not seeing enough of that yet.
I remember years ago interviewing Simon Longstaff from the Ethics Centre about this exact topic, and he said so many times he was told, no, we can't do anything about this rainmaker. They bring in so much revenue. And he said, and yet invariably, when people did finally bite the bullet, and it wasn't as often as he wished, and got rid of the person, they found productivity improved, because those people tend to, they don't create a great culture, and they actually keep other people's capacity limited. So it's an interesting one. And actually, Julia Banks had a good example this morning where she was giving advice to a CEO who had to confront a high performer who was doing the wrong thing. And in the end, she said to the CEO, the question is, can you trust him? And it was such an interesting way of putting it. And she said in the end, the CEO realised, well, no, I can't. So it is about weighing that up. But I think that is a very common thing, that somebody is protected, if you like, by the culture, which is why we talk a little bit too glibly about leadership. Sometimes those are very, very tough decisions, and people have to step up and make them. And in fact, we had Craig Drummond in the previous session talking about, I thought very frankly about how there needed to be actually much more mandatory measures. He talked about having mandatory targets. I think we often call them quotas, but he said, I think the ASX 200 has to be much more direct about this, and accountability. And I guess that's the other thing, which feeds in, and Sally, I'm sure you've seen this in the organisations you've been with, about how you report on this. How do you gather that evidence, and how do you feed that through at the very senior level?
And if we're saying we recognise the difficulty that women and men face who suffer sexual harassment in reporting, and we know that most people don't report, what are the ingredients that are going to help us build a culture where people feel safe reporting? One is an explicit culture, a trust in the leaders, so that you know that you can trust your leaders to deal effectively with it. Transparency around that process. So building a culture where people feel safe to report is likely to increase the reports. And I mean, you'll see, of course, that where people see that there is a change in a culture that makes them feel safer, you'll often see a surge in reporting. So I remember years ago, back when in the Pacific, one of the key performance indicators established by the government of Fiji was to see the number of complaints for sexual harassment go down. And I went, you must be joking, there were 6. You know, what you want is a surge of complaints. You want hundreds of complaints so that you know that people are feeling safe. So it's often scary to see complaints going up. But then once people see that they're effectively dealt with, then they might also change their behaviour. So you see a spike, and then it hopefully it reduces significantly, and then you're beginning to get to the extent of the problem. So you're beginning to see at least a real number or a good proportion of the real number of complaints. Yeah. And at that stage, then we can be assured that we're seeing a report on the actual incidents of sexual harassment. But that doesn't mean that it should be on the back of the person who experiences sexual harassment to carry that forward. There then needs to be a much more structural and systemic and institutional response, I think. Yeah. And so that's where we see different methods and mechanisms for addressing them that don't rely on a particular complainant taking forward a complaint. But I'll tell you another thing, and that is that most people, women and men, are invested in having a respectful workplace, and they want to see a respectful workplace. And so women will often overlook or ignore complaints or incidents of harassment that they suffer. They'll kind of explain it away. And certainly leaders don't want to know that they've got that kind of environment. So when there's a complaint coming through, a significant complaint, people often see them as a thorn in the side. They're a difficulty, you know, they're an annoyance because they're upsetting my vision of a happy culture, you know. Yeah. So I think we've got to think of how we build a situation where people feel that the most important thing to do is to make a complaint or record an incident that's happened, and then really deal honestly and effectively with it. It needs courage, as Prue said, and it needs honesty, and it needs significant and ongoing investment into this for some period of time before we get to a stage where it can be stamped out.
Yeah, and credibility about women's voices is another part of this equation as well, isn't it? Because we've talked a lot in this forum about putting the onus on women, but of course it's often one woman's word, and usually they are not the powerful, and that can be, of course, a fraught experience, and we know that women are still not believed in the same way as their male peers may well be. So that's a tricky one as well. Sorry, Skye, I think you was about to say something.
Just something that Sally said reminded me of a person along the way who spoke about making a complaint in the context of her workplace, her mining workplace. And she said to me that she'd worked prior to in the mine, she'd worked on a station, and there was no policy in place. There was no workplace policy or training on the policy. And she'd had some terrible encounters with sexual harassment in that space, but she didn't feel able to make a report. And I remember her saying to me that she did feel able to make a report about the sexual harassment that she experienced in the mines. And the reason for that was because there was policy, something tangible that she could point to, rather than saying your behaviour has hurt me. She was able to say your behaviour has breached the rules, and therefore I'm validated. I feel that that I'm credible and I'm able to make this complaint because there's something very tangible for me to point to. And that was a real difference in that person's experience, I think.
Yeah. And I think it's also important to point out that women who are not from what we would, I guess, say sort of mainstream, women who are from culturally diverse backgrounds, from other marginalised groups, have even less likelihood of being believed. And Skye, someone has asked about the research that you mentioned at the beginning when you were talking to some of these people, so you may want to pop something up. So there's clearly some interest in that. Well, I'm conscious we're getting towards the end of this part of the discussion. I guess I've been asking this a few times today, whether you feel optimistic. I mean, we've discussed that there is some change going on, and Sully's very wise comments that, you know, we do feel like we sometimes go 2 steps and then come 1 back. Nonetheless, are you feeling that we are at a moment where we can see some really tangible change emerging? And Rita, I might start with you.
Yeah, look, I think what I think of is that workplaces are a microcosm of our broader community as well. And sexual harassment, sexual violence is an issue not just in workplaces, but in public space, in family settings, in a number of settings. And so in parallel to this work that we're doing here in our workplaces, to sustain the momentum, I think you need the parallel effort in all of those settings. And organisations like our Watch or prevention work that occurs in different settings, really critical to sort of happen alongside what we're doing. If we can maintain that momentum across all those settings, I think we've got a greater hope of getting there in the long run.
Fantastic. Yeah, very good point. Sully?
Yes, you know, look, I think looking at working on this space over 20 years and seeing a change in the spectrum of compliance from initially in the 80s when the legislation was introduced, the first response of employers was to comply because it's the law. So simple compliance. Moving through the business case, we spent decades, as you know, Catherine, building business cases of why gender equality and eliminating sexual harassment are good for business, and that brought then another step forward. And then I think we really are beginning to see now some good employers, and you know, we've had some discussions here today by some of those who recognise that we stamp out sexual harassment because it's the right thing to do.
Yes.
I would not want to have anybody working in my workplaces who does not feel safe. And also, you know, matching that, the conversation from overt sexualised behaviour to exclusionary and marginalising practices to now talking about psychological safety. I see those two as spectrums that we're moving along. Not everybody is moving along those. We've got some serious recalcitrants, and we've got some people who are stuck back on the first steps of compliance. But I do see that we are building a much more sophisticated workforce in Australia, where some people are beginning to take us through the leading edge of doing this because it's the right thing to do, and I want a safe and functional and trusting workplace environment. And I see that as being a real step forward. So I do see that I do feel hopeful, and I also do think that particularly the private sector is at an inflection point generally. You know, if we let the private sector continue, you know, red in tooth and claw, pursuing only a profit motive, we as a human race are pretty much doomed. You know, there's climate change, gender inequality, and horizontal equality, vertical equality as well. And I think that we are beginning to see that capitalism recognises its role in building a world that we want to live in. And so not everybody, not all of it, there's a lot of recalcitrants out there. I do think that the conversation at the leading edge is moving on, and I'm really quite hopeful about that.
Yeah, fantastic. And Skye?
Just very finally, I think it's probably the product of the work that I'm doing at the moment with, it's called Boys from the Bush, looking at the perspective of men on the subject of sexual harassment. And I feel as though my hope comes from the fact that we're perhaps moving now into a space where we are drawing a line as a nation, and we do have clarity around what it is that we're seeking to achieve. I feel that that's really hopeful and optimistic. I feel like the next phase is really working out how we can move forward, acknowledging the different perspectives, men, women, employers, etc. Understanding that this can't be about shame. It can't be about the things that we can't control in the past. It can't be about blame anymore. We need to be, as a nation, moving into that optimistic, hopeful space that is really forward focused and is understanding of all of the different parts of the experience for us all that have actually brought us to this point. And you know, for many, many generations gone by, there are reasons why I think we've come to this culturally stuck moment. But the unsticking of that stuckness is where I think we need to be really focusing our attention now in a really positive, harmonious way.
Yes.
And I just have to say, it would be nice to have some senior leadership at a political level on this as well. So I'm looking forward to Grace's now. I think that that we absolutely need a government that's going to take some leadership on this and not just try and make it go away.
Absolutely.
Yes, and I think you'd find a lot of people listening today probably agree with you, absolutely. Thank you for such a lovely, rich and multi-layered conversation. It's been fantastic to have you, Skye, Sally and Rita. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Catherine.
Thank you.